So this lesson, we're going to be showing how to label the rest of the unit circle diagram. Here I already have, if you look at this unit circle diagram, all of the degree measures labeled. We did that a bunch. Hopefully you're good with that. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to find the rest of the radian measures. We're going to start with what we know. So it says, you know, the radian measures for angles of 0, 30, 45, and so on. I'm actually going to start out with the quadrantal angles, the angles that fall on the quadrant line, and just label those. So 0 degrees is 0 radians. I'm going to think about the 360 next. If I go the whole way around the circle, we know that that's 2 pi radians. Half of that, 180, is 1 pi, or just pi. And then if we cut between 0 and 180, that's half of pi up at 90, or pi over 2. And we're going to head towards writing them like that, even though we started out writing it 1/2 pi in the beginning. Between 1 and 2 is 1.5, and 1.5 is a fraction, is 3 over 2. So this is 3 pi over 2. The next ones I'm going to do are the ones that go with 45. And this is the order in which we learned them. So 45 is one we want to memorize. That's pi over 4. We can make sense of it because between 0 and pi over 2, right, between 0 and 1/2 is 1/4. Okay. Now, as we go around, this is 1/4, 2/4 is 1/2. This is 3/4. Okay, 4/4, 5/4, 6/4 is 3/2, and then 7/4 is over here. And then the last thing we learned, most recently, we learned these two angles. I should have underlined 270 in my first set. And those are just our special angles. So we can think about dividing things up, but as I said, the first quadrant radians you just really want to know without thinking about them. So this is pi over 6, and this one is pi over 3. I'm going to put that one in red. And actually we'll put this one in black because we're going to use those to find the rest of them. So we're going to actually start with this pi over 6. Over here it says, recall to find 150, okay, 210, and 330. We added or subtracted the 30 from the pi over 6. So we're going to do the same thing with the radian measure. So here we have pi over 6, equivalent to 30. So if I want to get what goes with 150, I'm going to think about the fact that this pi over here, if I wanted to make a fraction with a 6, that would be 6 over 6. 6 over 6 is equal to 1. If I subtract that, subtract 1/6, not that, sorry, 1/6. So if I take 6 over 6 and subtract 1/6, that gives me 5/6, or 5 pi over 6. So just like we do 180 minus 30 to get 150, we do 6/6 pi, 1 pi, minus 1/6 pi, and get 5/6 pi. Using similar reasoning, if I add in this direction, so 6/6 pi plus 1/6 pi is 7/6 pi. Moving over here, 2 pi could be written as an equivalent fraction with 12/6 pi. 12/6 minus 1/6 is 11/6. Okay? And to keep that in black to see how they're related to each other when we look at the whole picture. So to summarize over here, when we want to find radian measures that are equivalent to 150, 210, and 330, we add or subtract pi over 6 from either pi or 2 pi, depending on the quadrant. So I'm going to show the angle that goes with 150. What we did for that one is we're closest to pi, right? 150 is closer to pi than 2 pi. I need to subtract to get to the smaller angle. So I did pi minus 1 pi over 6. I subtracted the equivalent measure to 30. I made this a 6 over 6 to get an LCD, and that gave me 5 pi over 6. So that's the work. It is tricky. This is something if you were in class, we would definitely go over and people would need help with. Okay, but that's the gist of it. So to get the remaining ones, we do exactly the same thing. So here I'm going to try to keep both on here, and I'll move this out of the way. It says recall to find 120, 240, and 300. So to find each of these angles, when we were working in degrees, we added or subtracted 60. And then we just have to ask what is the equivalent radian measure. So now I'm going to be adding or subtracting pi over 3. So if I come over here, now this is not helpful. Having 6 over 6 on my pi is not helpful. I need to make that 3 over 3, so then I can add or subtract the 1/3 pi that is pi over 3. So if I subtract it, 3/3 minus 1/3 is 2/3, or 2 pi over 3. 3/3 plus 1/3. So now we have 4 pi over 3. And then here, my 12/6 is not helpful. I'm going to rewrite 2 as 6/3. So if I subtract 1/3, this is 5/3 or 5 pi over 3. So just to summarize, to find the radian measures that are equivalent to 120, 240, and 300, we're adding or subtracting pi over 3. And we're always going off the x-axis to find our angles. It's what lets us think of trig in an organized way. There's lots of reasons we go off the x-axis, but basically that's the rule we start with and everything comes from it, okay? So here, the two things I'm adding or subtracting from are pi or 2 pi. And just to give a little more information here, if I am in the second or the third quadrant, right, I added or subtracted to get into the second, added to get into the third from pi. And then here in the fourth quadrant, right, we subtracted from 2 pi. And that's a little bit of just logic, like how do I get into a quadrant from the x-axis? Do I get smaller? Do I get bigger in terms of the angle? So let's look at this information. We labeled all this on the unit circle. I'm going to write one example on this piece. This time, my example, let's do an example with 240. So to get that 240, I took pi, which I made 3 pi over 3, and I added this time to get into the third quadrant, the 1 pi over 3, and that gave me 4 pi over 3. So the other ones are also examples, but I think it's a little less crowded to write it that way. So this is a note. Even though we learned how to find the radian measures for 135, 225, and 315 by thinking about fractions of a circle, remember how we went around the circle counting in fourths, we can also add or subtract pi over 4 from pi over or 2 pi, depending on the quadrant. So just looking back at the picture up top, here when I look at this, for example, when I have 3 pi over 4, that comes from 4 over 4 pi. So if I made this 4 over 4, which would also be equivalent to 1, I subtract 1/4 and I get 3/4. I add 1/4 and I get 5/4. 2 would be 8/4, and I subtract 1/4 to get 7/4. So those are also, the green ones are also consistent in terms of using that method I used for finding the pi over 6, or using the pi over 6 to find the black answers, and using the pi over 3 to find the red answers. Now, this will be more important a little bit later in the unit, but we're going to give some vocabulary to this. These values that are added or subtracted to find angles in other quadrants are known as reference angles. So that word reference, it's like a starting point. The reference angles we have worked with so far in degrees are 30, 45, and 60, right? Those are the angles that we use to get in the other quadrants. And the angles in radians are pi over 6, pi over 4, and pi over 3. And that's why it's so important to memorize those, because if you don't know the pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, you can't find anything else using them as reference angles. The more you look for patterns in anything in trig, but for the example here and the radian measures on the unit circle, it can make learning it a lot easier. So that's why we talk about, how do I find them? I don't just memorize all the different numbers. I think about where they come from.